Hey everybody, it's Tony D with a screenwriter's take on The Irishman. Yes, I watched the entire Irishman movie all in one clip. It was daytime when I started, and it's dark now. It's nighttime now. It is an incredibly long movie. So let's start with the non-spoiler review. There's not a lot to spoil in the movie, right, Joan? Joan was asleep through most of it. You know, it centers around hitman Frank Sheeran, I think you pronounced his name. And he was Irish and he worked for the mafia guys in Philly, New York area at a time in the late 60s, early 70s, that era, the era of Jimmy Hoffa. Now, Hoffa died in 75, and during that time, you know, before he was running things, and then he went to jail. I think he went to jail like in, I want to say like 70, 71, somewhere about that time, and then he came back and tried to take back the Union, and that's when, you know, all their troubles start. So it kind of centers around Frank and his friendship with Hoffa, but Hoffa is not in the movie until almost an hour in, okay? So it's a three-way friendship that Scorsese is portraying. It's between him and a mobster by the name of Russell, who was like the right-hand man of Angelo Bruno of the Philly mob. And Angelo Bruno, I know something about him. He was known as the Gentle Don. He was a guy who was well, he kept low key and he tried not to make a lot of waves. And the mob in Philly was pretty successful. That was like one of their major successful eras then. But like all mobsters, you have to have a balance between your violence and your power and your fear and having too much of that. Too much, the feds crack down on you and you can't keep your enemies at bay. Too little, and your enemies sense that you're weak and come in and finish you off. So, what happened in this era, this was really the pinnacle of mafia power in the United States so far. They were coming off of the bootlegging era, which they parlayed into stuff in the 40s and 50s. They made even more money, and they built Las Vegas, and they prospered as the country did. So the Teamsters Union was kind of their high watermark because really Hoffa, you know, he controlled billions of dollars. The mob was using it to get loans to build more and more casinos and things. And they were trying to influence the U.S. government to take back Cuba so they could get back their casinos and hotels they lost when Fidel Castro took over. And they kind of almost succeeded. I mean, if the Bay of Pigs had succeeded in some way, they could have rolled back in there and started up their operations again. But it didn't work out. It didn't work out for a lot of people in that era. And as money disappeared, people died. So what does this all have to do with the movie? Well, the movie, not a whole lot, because it focuses mostly just on Hoffa and not so much the events. And so, you know, it's hard to give a non-spoiler or spoiler review, really, because it's kind of based on history. But a friend of mine forwarded me an article about the movie, which led me to watch it, basically saying that there's evidence to suggest that Sheeran, who's the main character in the movie that it's all based on, was lying about a lot of things when he sort of gave his deathbed confession. And really, he was probably not the guy who killed Hoffa, according to the article, because some of the facts he remembers are wrong, and they have evidence that other guys probably killed Hoffa, and his description of what was done is probably too elaborate and convoluted to be the truth. So, now, here's my non-spoiler review, although that's a bit of a spoiler right there. The movie's too long. I mean, it's just too long. There's a lot of fat in that movie. And look, if you're going to do a 3.5 hour movie and drill down and explore these characters and their depth, great. I'm all about it. The problem is you don't get much more depth. This feels like a 2 hour movie stretched out to 3.5 hours. There's just more scenes. And do we really learn more about a hitman and his mafia associates? Not really. There is a bit with Sheeran's daughter really liking Jimmy Hoffa and somehow just having the sixth sense that, oh, you're a mobster and you're bad. But Jimmy Hoffa wasn't bad. Jimmy Hoffa was pretty corrupt and bad. I mean, he wasn't a gangster, but he was about as close as you could be to a gangster without being one. You know, maybe he couldn't order murders, although he might have. But he certainly was not, a guy. He wasn't happy, full of gumdrops kind of guy. He was practically a mobster. Practically. So there's another thing Scorsese does, which only mafia files would have any interest in. And that is he introduces famous mafia figures, especially from the Philly area in that era, and when they died. And it has almost no impact on the movie. Some of the mafia figures, like Phil Testa. Phil Testa shows up into the scene, and there's a freeze, and it says, when Phil died and how he died. It doesn't. That's the only time he's in the movie. I mean, I think he's in the background of some shots, but he's not a major character in the movie. And they do that for 5 or 6 other mafia figures, but they're kind of irrelevant to Hoffa and what happened to him. They were kind of tangentially involved in that era, but the moment they introduced that, I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. We're going to see the death of Angelo Bruno and the fallout from that, which, by the way, was pretty murderous in Philadelphia if you've never seen or read about that era. And guess what? They skipped completely over it. By that time, Sharon's old. He's out of the loop. He goes to jail for a time. So, the era of Angelo Bruno being dead, and he didn't have much to do with Hoffa either, except that he was in the mob too. So what was the point of showing us, oh, there's Angelo Bruno, here's where he died, here's this guy, here's where he died. The only 3 people we're really interested in are Pesci, Pacino, and De Niro, because they're the 3 main characters, and it's about their friendship. So this extraneous noise about the other mobsters, for a guy like me who wrote books about mobsters and other things about them, I kind of knew the information, but it wasn't even of that interest to me because they didn't really get into those characters and what they were about and why we should be concerned. So other than getting to see Ray Romano play yet another serious role, it's funny how all these comedians they go into serious acting later in life. Ray Romano seems to be going down the gangster path. But it doesn't really add much. Pacino gives a pretty great performance, and so does Pesci, who comes out of retirement for this movie. But the technology used to make them young and then kind of older, not so great. I mean, it's okay. They do look younger, but the problem with the technology is it doesn't do what it did to, for instance, Chris Evans in Captain America. So if you watch Captain America, you see the early shots of him, and he's so skinny and short and small and runty. And then they do that for a while in the movie, and then later, when he's Captain America, well, they just turn all that stuff off, and it's Chris Evans all buffed up, right? So when they do that, it's pretty crazy. You're like, wow, look at that guy. And even his head is like, shaped. The problem with the technology is, right now anyway, all they've really done for this is smooth out the wrinkles. They're still pretty puffy. They still don't move like young guys. And I got to say, they weren't acting like young guys. To me, young guys should have been more energetic. They should be more like, you know, hey, let's go get some broads. Hey, let's go get some booze. Let's get hammered. You know, young guys, they go out drinking, they get hammered, and they do stupid things. Older guys, even mobsters, they, when they're older, they don't do that, right? Because they learned their lesson. There wasn't really of that, and yet we're expected to believe that, okay, these guys were young, and now we're seeing them through most of their lives, most of their adult lives. Didn't feel that way. It felt like, and they kept cutting back between different times, which was also a weird framing device. It didn't really work. The movie starts with, in my view, it didn't work. The movie starts with Sheeran in the old folks' home and ends with that. So that's a framing device. But then it cuts to this trip to Detroit where eventually they kill Hoffa, or Sheeran kills Hoffa. But so it's a flashback within a flashback. And then within the trip, we're flashing back to other times. So like he's remembering and remembering and remembering, and we're like 4 flashbacks deep into this thing. It's like Mafia Inception. Too much, too confusing, and the technology really didn't work. It doesn't look that great to me. De Niro looked, I mean, in the first scene where they're the youngest they could possibly be, they kind of look young. But then later in their prime, they don't look that young. You know, they don't look that young. Especially Pesci. He's lost a lot of weight. And later in the movie, when they're showing them, you know, falling apart in the prison, yeah, they look really, really old. That was more realistic, I guess, because, you know, they can just put the makeups on the real guys, and those guys are up there. I mean, you know, they're all in their, like, 70s, I think. So it's not hard for them to look old. But they didn't look young. They didn't move great. I think they needed to do something else if they wanted to sell that. They needed younger actors, maybe put their face, do a deep fake, you know, put a De Niro's face on a young actor and you know, sink the face into the cheekbones a little bit so he looks young, and give him muscles and, like, you know, have the guy move like a young guy before we transitioned into, you know, older De Niro, mob boss, not mob boss, but, you know, Teamster power broker De Niro or whatever he was. And, you know, there's just a lot of scenes that aren't really telling. You know, they're not all that great. I think Pacino does a really good voice, and I think Pesci does a neat turn as a low-key mobster. But again, it didn't feel like, you know, it didn't feel like we were seeing anything. It felt like we were seeing a side character. And same thing with De Niro. There were very low-key performances, low energy. And I didn't feel very much intensity, especially because the damn movie's so long. I mean, by the last half hour of this movie, I just wanted it to end. I really just wanted it to end. It's too long, too much fat. I didn't need to see a long, arduous scene at the end with him and the priest. Just didn't need to see it. And it felt long. It wasn't even that long, but by that time, it felt long. There were all kinds of scenes like that. Scenes of De Niro driving places and walking and saying hello to people. These are all scenes that are cut in regular movies for a reason. They don't move the story forward or don't move it forward fast enough. Okay? They don't tell us anything new. And because they jumped around within this era, which is like early 60s to mid to late 70s and then jump into the 90s, there wasn't much delineation there. So when you're jumping from like mafia scene to another mafia scene like 8 years later or 8 years before, it's confusing. You know, it kind of all looks the same and blends together. So unless you're steeped in mafia events, even I was having trouble finding what year is this. I was going, what year is this? Okay, when was this after Kennedy, before Kennedy? And really, there's not much there in terms of adding to the conversation about Hoffa. And then when they kill Hoffa, there's not much of a focus on it, right? It happens, and then they get rid of the body, and they show you what happens, and then it's like, well, that's all it was. That's all it was. That's why we tuned in to see the movie. What happened? What happened after they cremated him? What did they do with the ashes? How do you put a gun in the crematorium and not have the bullets explode? Like, how did this all get covered up? That, since it was about Hoffa, I thought they would go into that a bit, but they didn't. Now, there was a good scene, I think, where Sheeran's got to talk to the widow of the man he murdered, but, that's it. I mean, it was a long wait for that scene. And again, it was a long wait just to see Pacino in the damn movie. So I don't see what this really adds. I really don't. It was, maybe if you had cut it down to a lean 2 hours and really kicked up the pacing, it would have been better. Maybe if you had more of that Scorsese, edgy music, because there was a lot of stuff happening in the early 70s and 60s. I mean, how about some, guitar music like he had in some of these other movies? The soundtrack on this, and I only mention it because it's Scorsese, and Scorsese is a guy who's very big on soundtracks, I think, and typically picks these like driving songs, and it's like, when Pesci in Goodfellas beats those guys to, I think it was Goodfellas, right? No, it was Casino. He beats those guys to Devo's cover of I Can't Get No Satisfaction. I mean, it's an intense scene. They're playing like light 50s music throughout this, and it's kind of boring. There's a lot of boring scenes in this. Scenes of like hospitals and funeral homes and weddings and, dinners. Okay, I mean, I get it. You're showing a different side of the mafia life, that it was more routine, that Sharon, went on with his life and never really went to jail, never really paid for his crimes in jail, but really paid for them, through his family, through his daughter. I get it. I don't need to see every detail of him driving past Hoffa over to the house where they're going to kill him. It didn't seem like it worked. It just didn't seem like it worked. It didn't feel like a betrayal because we already knew the betrayal was coming. We already know the history of this. And evidence suggests that this isn't even the history. So what do we got here? At this point, you might as well make up the story. If you made up the story, you could create more dramatic tension. Otherwise, there wasn't a lot here. There was a few, there was a lot of cameos here. A few famous actors, but I didn't feel this was intense. I didn't feel like, wow, I am watching something that really happened. I felt like I was watching a version of something that happened after I read that article. Kind of ruined it for me in some small way, but it feels like, okay, if this is true, well then mafia guys are pretty boring too. Like. That could be the takeaway. And if that's the takeaway, I think that wasn't meant to be. I mean, I don't think that was the takeaway. I think it was supposed to be about this friendship and how he had to betray his friendship. And there just wasn't enough there. And if you're going to make stuff up, then there should have been more. There should have been more. This guy should have been like, Hoffa should have been like his best friend. And there should have been less of the relationship between De Niro and Pesci and more of Hoffa, because Hoffa's the guy who gets killed. So it makes total sense that De Niro sides with Pesci's character because they were friends first and they were friends longer. He was friends with Pesci. He wouldn't even have met Hoffa without Pesci. And they were just good buddies. So, Hoffa was the new guy. So, I mean, it's not that big of a leap to say, well, I gotta pick one over the other. I'm gonna pick my older friend. Um, so the intensity just wasn't there. There was something missing from this movie. Uh, Part of it, I think, is on the screenplay, and I think there's just too many things going on, too many threads, and this is the danger of doing a historical thing or something based on a book. You're kind of tied to the book, and the book's not good. If the events aren't good, and it's tough to, without making major changes, it's tough to make them good. And there's so much info on these guys, and we've seen a lot of it before. And there was just a lot of fat in this movie that just didn't really add to anything. So I'm sorry, The Irishman just didn't do it for me. I'm a little sorry I watched it, and that it hurts me to say that for a Martin Scorsese film. I have a great deal of respect for the craft and everybody who worked on the movie, but I feel like, they would have been better off doing something original. Just doing something new. Sorry. Anyhow, that's my take on The Irishman.